Why does no one talk about the terrifying power wielded by the priests who controlled the fate of thousands with nothing but clay tablets? What secrets did the Assyrians and Babylonians keep hidden within their walls? And why did their empires collapse so suddenly? Ancient Mesopotamia, a land where humanity's darkest secrets and greatest triumphs were forged. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about the beginning of civilization is a lie? For centuries, we've been taught that history begins with Egypt, Greece, or Rome. But Mesopotamia, the world's first true civilization, has been buried in the shadows, intentionally hidden from us. As we dig deeper into the unseen power structures of the ancient world, we'll reveal the truth behind the first empire, the invention of writing, and the mysterious fall of the most advanced civilization of its time. These were not just people, they were architects of control, manipulating their world in ways that still influence us today, but with devastating consequences. Stay tuned. The shocking truth about the origins of law, human sacrifice, and the dawn of urban civilization is just the beginning. The dawn of civilization, the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. This land is where civilization was born. But what if I told you that everything you've been taught about its rise is a carefully curated lie? What if the true story is darker, more complex, and buried so deep that the real architects of power were not the kings and gods, but the people who controlled knowledge itself? For centuries, history has romanticized ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. But Mesopotamia, the true birthplace of civilization, has been conveniently overlooked. Why? What is it that we still don't know about the first empire, the first kings, and the first laws? Why is Mesopotamia so crucial to the story of human progress, and yet remains shrouded in mystery and manipulation? The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians didn't just build cities, they built the framework of power, power that we still unknowingly live under today. But it wasn't just the rise of the first urban centers or the invention of writing. It was the control of information that made them so dangerous. They didn't just write laws, they wrote history, and in doing so, they created a world where what you believed could determine whether you lived or died. What if the greatest story of Mesopotamian power isn't about their monumental cities or grand empires, but about how they manipulated their own people with knowledge? What if their true legacy wasn't just about kings and gods, but about a hidden conspiracy to control knowledge, resources, and ultimately human fate? Mesopotamian scribes didn't just record transactions, they recorded the future, shaping the destiny of everyone within their reach and even those who came after them. What lies beneath these ancient ruins? What secrets have been buried beneath the weight of centuries of sand, stone, and silence? There are still ancient tablets hidden beneath the ground of Mesopotamia that we can't even read yet. What they contain could completely rewrite the history of civilization. These aren't just the writings of kings. These are the writings of the masters, those who understood that knowledge is the ultimate power. The real story of Mesopotamia is not about the rise of cities, but about the rise of knowledge, the dark secrets behind the creation of laws, gods, and cities that define human society for millennia. When the ice retreated, it didn't just change the climate, it unleashed humanity's darkest potential. It gave them something more powerful than fire or tools. It gave them control over life itself, and that control would tear the world apart. But who gets the food? Who controls this new power? And what happens to those who don't? Evidence from settlements like Jericho, Catalhoyuk, and Abu Huraira shows us the truth about early farming. It wasn't just about growing crops. It was about building empires. These early farmers didn't just plant seeds. They planted the roots of power, and the first cities grew as the ground was fertilized with secrets of control. The early Sumerian priests and the Bible tell us of a time when gods weren't just worshipped, they were invented. Early rulers used religion to reinforce their control, positioning themselves as intermediaries between humans and the divine. They didn't just need to own the crops, they needed to own the people who worked them. And in return for their labor, the first farmers didn't receive freedom. They received the promise of survival, but only if they obeyed the God-King who controlled the land. Now we're faced with a question that will haunt us through history. What happens when you control the most basic necessity of life? When the earth gives you the power to survive, but in return, you are forced to give up your freedom? As we'll soon discover, the first farmers didn't just create food surpluses. They created social hierarchies, slavery, and wars. The next section will show us the dark side of agriculture. When the food runs low, who will be sacrificed? Who will control the power? Who owns the seeds and who will be left hungry? And most chilling of all, who gets to decide who lives and who dies? What if the first civilization was not a place of peace and progress, but the beginning of human oppression? The moment we first settled down, we didn't just build homes, we created prisons. Around 10,000 BCE, after the Ice Age, the world was changing. No longer bound by the forces of nature, early humans faced a new dilemma: to stay or to roam. For the first time, humanity took root, quite literally, by planting crops. It was a moment of incredible potential, but it was also a moment of terrible consequence. Settling down didn't mean freedom. It meant control. It's hard to believe, but the first true civilization wasn't about art, philosophy, or peaceful trade. It was about ownership, survival, and inequality. The first settlements like Jericho weren't peaceful havens. They were fortresses of division. Division between the haves and the have-nots. The few who controlled the land and the many who had nothing to trade but their labor. The early villages of Tal Murray, Jericho, and Abu Huraira were not simply the cradle of agriculture. They were the birthplaces of inequality. The first walls were not built to keep animals out. They were built to keep people in. These settlements were the foundation of control, not freedom. In the villages, people weren't just living, they were beginning to build systems of authority. But who really controlled this land? Who were the early leaders of these communities? Was it the priests? Was it the landowners? Or was it something more sinister? The first kings didn't just reign, they enslaved. They didn't rule through wisdom, they ruled through fear and deception. Archaeological evidence from Jericho and other early settlements tells a disturbing story. The first human settlements weren't founded by peaceful farmers, but by those who needed control. Why? Because control over food meant control over life. The walls of Jericho weren't just protection, they were symbols of dominance. The first rulers, as revealed by early Sumerian texts and biblical stories, didn't just rule with divine right, they used religion as a tool. The gods didn't just grant humanity abundance, they granted power to the few. And those in power quickly realized that they could control the food, land, and labor. They could control everything. This wasn't the rise of civilization, it was the rise of the first exploitative systems. But here's the shocking truth. Agriculture wasn't just the key to wealth, it was the key to oppression. Who owned the land? And what happened to those who didn't? Could it be that the first settlers didn't just work the land, but they became slaves to it? And when food became wealth, who paid the price? The next section will reveal the hidden power dynamics that led to the rise of the first god kings and how the people who worked the land became their property. The rise of Jericho, Catalhoyuk, and other early settlements wasn't just about planting crops. It was about creating a system. The first leaders didn't just start farming, they started manipulating the people. Power didn't come from strength. It came from controlling food and controlling the people who depended on it. The first wars weren't fought over territory. They were fought over the resources to feed those who would eventually fight wars. We'll explore how the first leaders used force and deception to solidify their power, and how ancient mythologies were born as a way to justify oppression and enslavement. What if everything you've been told about history is a lie? What if the first civilizations weren't built on peace, but control? Right now, you're standing on the edge of a truth so shocking, it could change everything you think you know about humanity's origins. Don't wait for someone else to uncover this. Hit subscribe now, because what's coming next will leave you questioning the very foundation of our past. Thousands of years ago, humanity stumbled upon a discovery that would change the world forever. Not the wheel, not fire, but something far more sinister. Ownership. The first cities were born not from the desire for safety or prosperity, but from the need to control. It's 3,500 BCE, a time when the Earth is still recovering from the brutal Ice Age. In the Fertile Crescent, a lush, fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a new world begins to take shape. But this world is not a utopia. It's the first experiment in human subjugation. In these first settlements, Jericho, Uruk, Eridu, a stark truth emerges. Power was not about wisdom or peace, but about dominance. The first cities weren't built to protect humanity. They were designed to enslave it. And here, for the first time in history, control over food becomes control over life. But who really owned the land? Was it the gods, the priests, or the landowners? The truth is much darker than you think. When humanity began to settle down, it wasn't a peaceful arrival. It was a struggle for power. It was no coincidence that the first cities arose where water and land could be controlled. Control of the rivers meant control of the people. But who had the right to control the rivers? The landowners, the priests. Did they choose who would live and who would die? In Uruk, Eridu, and Jericho, walls rose around the cities, but these weren't walls of protection. These were walls of control, prisons, built not to keep invaders out, but to keep people in. And behind these walls, a brutal truth emerged. The first rulers didn't rise from the will of the people, but from the strength of their control over the food and labor that everyone needed to survive. But here's the shocking truth. The moment humans began to farm and stay in one place, they didn't progress. They were enslaved by the very systems they built. The first cities were not places of freedom, but birthplaces of oppression. The first cities weren't about family life. They were about divide and conquer. Archaeological evidence from Sumerian tablets in Jericho tells us this. The very moment humans stopped being nomads, they were enslaved by the very land they cultivated. And those who ruled the land, priests, kings, and landowners, didn't just own the crops, they owned life itself. It was in Uruk, the first great city, that the first written records emerged. But these weren't epic stories. They were records of grain and cattle. Who owned these resources? The elite. Who worked for them? The masses. And behind the scenes, hidden from most, were the first chains of slavery. Not shackles of iron, but chains of dependence. The first rulers didn't just control land, they controlled your ability to eat, to work, and to survive. But here's the question. How did these early rulers maintain control over their people? Was it divine right? Or was there a darker force at work, something even the rulers didn't fully control? Was the rise of cities the result of peaceful leaders, or was it an unholy alliance between the gods and the landowners? The rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were not simply the lifeblood of civilization. They were the swords that determined who lived, who died, and who ruled. But what if the true foundation of civilization wasn't just agriculture and temples, but the dread of nature itself, manipulated by the very leaders who claim to speak for the gods? It's 3,500 BCE, the end of the Ice Age, and humanity has begun to settle. But it wasn't a peaceful decision. It was a desperate gamble. The Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is lush and bountiful. But this abundance comes at a cost. The very rivers that give life bring with them the curse of control. Floods, droughts, and the constant threat of nature's unpredictable wrath hold the key to understanding the first cities. The rise of Sumerian cities like Uruk and Eridu isn't just a triumph of agriculture, it's the birth of centralized power. The first rulers didn't just control crops, they controlled who survived and who didn't. It wasn't about building walls to protect the people, it was about building walls to protect power. But there's a hidden truth. They didn't conquer nature. They learned to exploit it in the most devastating ways imaginable. It's easy to think of rivers as simple lifelines that sustain life. But what if I told you that the greatest weapon of ancient Mesopotamian rulers wasn't their armies or their gods? It was water? The control over the Tigris and Euphrates wasn't just a matter of irrigation. It was a matter of survival, but not for everyone. Those who controlled the riverbanks held the power to decide who lived and who died. The first cities were built in the backs of the people who toiled the fields, harvested crops, and constructed monuments. But it wasn't just about work. It was about control. The rivers could be used to feed the masses or to flood their homes. The first kings didn't just rule with swords, they ruled with the floodgates. Could these early rulers manipulate flooding as a means of asserting dominance? We often think of Mesopotamian rulers as god kings, but how did they become gods in the first place? Cuneiform records don't just describe divine blessings, they detail the manipulation of nature itself. The rivers didn't just flood, they flooded at will, and those who held the keys to the canals and gates could control when the water rose. This wasn't just about managing water flow, this was about managing the fate of the people. Priests who performed rituals didn't just appease the gods, they performed ceremonies that controlled water. Who was really in control of the floods? Who decided when to allow irrigation and when to destroy crops and villages? The first kings were not merely military conquerors, they were engineers of nature, who mastered the art of destruction as much as they mastered agriculture. When they spoke of divine will, were they speaking to the gods, or were they speaking to the people who were at their mercy when the floods came? You're probably wondering, was it the gods who made the rivers flood? Or was it the kings who controlled the water and used the floods as tools of fear? Were the gods controlling the rivers? Or were the priests manipulating the people through their connection to these same gods? As we move forward, we will explore the first rulers of these cities, who didn't just control land and crops, but the very forces of nature that defined life itself. And as we uncover how these ancient kings built their power, you'll see how floods, famine, and control over water would shape every corner of their reigns. But here's the darkest question of all. How far did they go to control the rivers? And at what cost to the lives of those who relied on them for their very survival? It wasn't just the rivers of Mesopotamia that defined his future, it was the terrifying control over them. Beneath the glittering surface of agricultural success and urban growth lay a much darker truth. Irrigation, the very lifeblood of civilization, became the most manipulative weapon ever forged by humankind. And it was all about control. But control over what exactly? The time is circa 3000 BCE, a period of radical transformation. In a land torn between deserts and unpredictable rivers, the very first cities, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, emerged from the earth as a remarkable symbol of human ingenuity. The key figure here isn't just the king or the priest, it's the water itself. While rulers like Gilgamesh and Lugal-Zaggisi are remembered for their conquests, their true power came not from their swords, but from their control of water. They ruled not just over cities, they commanded life itself. But the key question is, how? Irrigation, so often seen as the cornerstone of early agriculture, was in reality a tool of unprecedented power. It wasn't about just watering crops. It was about how much water you allowed to flow, when you let it flood, and who got to decide. Those who controlled the rivers controlled fate itself. Imagine this. A king stands over the canals, his decisions dictating whether the fields live or die. This isn't about agriculture. This is about life and death. In a world where survival depended on crops, water control was the ultimate form of domination. But here's the twist. The rulers didn't just control water, they manipulated it. They didn't just use irrigation to survive, they used it to assert their dominance over their own people and the neighboring regions. The true power of these ancient civilizations didn't just lie in their ability to build canals. It lay in their ability to control the labor, to force people to work, and to punish those who resisted. The greatest invention of Mesopotamian civilization wasn't just the ability to cultivate crops, it was the art of domination. Rulers didn't merely use irrigation to grow food, they used it to build and control cities. Ancient records show that irrigation was dictated by laws, often brutal and coercive. Laborers, those who worked the land, were not just free farmers. They were subjects, forced into work under harsh conditions, and their loyalty was ensured by fear. What made them stay in line? The looming threat of drought, the flood that could wipe out crops, and the ruler who controlled it all. Here's the chilling truth. Priests and kings didn't just speak to the gods, they used water as divine power. The entire urbanization of Mesopotamia wasn't built on trade or military power. It was built on the ability to control the rivers, and with them, the fate of the people. But here's the darker secret. As the cities grew, ecological imbalance grew with them. These rulers didn't just engineer the environment, they exploited it. Floods could be manipulated as punishment, droughts as tools of coercion. The canals weren't just conduits for water, they were weapons. As we move deeper into the story of Mesopotamia, we must ask, how long can you keep control of the rivers before they begin to fight back? Could the rulers' constant manipulation of the rivers eventually lead to the collapse of the very civilization they worked to build? Did ecological disasters, caused by their very manipulation of water, bring down the first great cities of Mesopotamia? How long could irrigation keep the illusion of control intact? The tension between life and death, between flood and famine, between control and chaos is about to reach its boiling point. Stay tuned, because the real cost of power in Mesopotamia is about to be revealed. And it's not what you think. What if the world's first great cities were not built on dreams of progress, but on the backs of slaves, driven by the unrelenting desire to control life itself. Uruk and Eridu, the cradle of civilization, were not just centers of trade and agriculture. They were factories of power, where every brick laid, every temple constructed, and every canal dug was done so at the cost of human suffering. But this wasn't a struggle for survival. This was a struggle for domination. It's 3,500 BCE. The fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates is about to witness the birth of true cities. The dream of civilization, large cities, monumental temples, irrigation systems that defy nature itself, is about to become a reality. But these cities, Uruk and Eridu, are not being built by eager farmers or traders. They are being built by the oppressed, driven by the whims of a handful of elites who knew the power of water and religion to control their destiny. The story of these cities isn't one of growth and prosperity, it's one of blood and labor. And the key figures in this story aren't just the priests, the rulers, or the merchants. No, the true players in this drama are the laborers who, under the guise of divine order, worked tirelessly to create a world of oppression masked as progress. Uruk wasn't just a city, it was the first machine of war, and it didn't just grow because of its economic prosperity. It grew because of its ability to subjugate. The ruling elites of Uruk mastered the art of religious manipulation, using temples as the bedrock of their power. These were not temples of devotion, but prisons of control, where the gods were not worshipped. They were used. And Gilgamesh, their greatest king, wasn't just a leader. He was a tool for the religious elites to keep the people in check. But here's the twist. Eridu, Uruk's rival, wasn't some peaceful agricultural city. No, it was a city of secrets, a place where the first kings didn't just wield power with strength, they wielded it with deception. The kings didn't just rule, they were worshipped as gods. But the real question is, how much of God's will was actually the will of powerful men? As Uruk and Eridu expanded, the world saw the rise of the first urban elites. But these weren't just kings. They were manipulators of divine will. The elite classes didn't just control the land, they controlled the gods. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were centers of wealth, power, and exploitation. The rulers used religion as the ultimate tool of coercion, justifying their despotism with the claim that they had the divine right to dominate the people. But as the cities grew, so did the human cost. The workers who tilled the land, built the canals, and constructed the temples were not free. They were subjugated under the rule of these powerful elites. What was once a community of farmers now became a complex society of oppression, a society built not on cooperation, but on coercion. And this is just the beginning. As Uruk and Eridu grew, their rivalry turned into a battle for supremacy, and soon the price of domination would become too high. But what happens when the despots realize that their control over life, through water, religion, and labor, has turned them into tyrants? Will the city's rise eventually lead to their collapse? Did their ambition cost them not just their humanity, but their empire? Stay tuned as the story of Uruk, Eridu, and their kings unfolds, where power is not just held by the gods, but by the hands of those who dare to control them. What if the first cities were born not from a desire to build, but from a need to control, to dominate the very forces of nature that had once given humans life? What if the birth of civilization was not a peaceful evolution of agriculture, but the violent struggle to harness unpredictable rivers, to conquer nature, and ultimately to enslave the people who lived in these cities? 3,500 BCE. Amidst the unforgiving desert of the Middle East, a crucial moment in human history was unfolding. Cities were rising, not as peaceful centers of culture and trade, but as fortresses of power, where the first elites learned to wield control over water, labor, and people. These cities, Uruk and Eridu, were not born out of necessity, but out of the need for domination. The question isn't why people began farming, but why they began to build cities at all. These first cities weren't just places of growth. They were the birthplaces of tyranny, where religion, warfare, and coercion went hand in hand. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't just rivers. They were tools in the hands of early rulers who wanted to control the very essence of life, water. But here's the twist. Was it the land that pushed humanity into cities, or was there a deeper reason that forced people into permanent settlements? The rivers, with their unpredictable flooding cycles, could either destroy or nurture. Early humans would have understood that, but they didn't just build cities to survive. Why did they settle in a land so volatile? Why didn't they choose more stable areas? Was there something about this land that beckoned them in? Something hidden? Something dangerous? Uruk's rise was rapid, almost unnatural. But cities don't just grow on their own. They are planned, strategically positioned. And the rulers of these cities didn't build on fertile lands. They conquered them. The land didn't give them a choice. They created their own destiny. Could it be that early rulers didn't just use the rivers for farming, but used them to control the people, to enslave them? And could the rivers themselves have become the key to the creation of an imperial system, one that would dominate the entire region? Early Mesopotamian cities weren't just the result of agriculture or water. They were built from violence, control, and coercion. The rulers of Uruk didn't just build their cities for convenience. They built them to expand their power. Power over the land and, just as crucially, power over the people. The first city rulers didn't just want food, they wanted domination. The early gods of Mesopotamia, like Enki and Inanna, were not just deities. They were tools used by kings to justify rule by divine right. What if this wasn't a natural progression? What if agriculture and city building were merely a mask for something darker? Could it be that slavery, in its most ancient form, began not as a result of warfare, but as the result of rivers, in irrigation, and water control? The cities didn't just need food, they needed labor, and the rivers gave them the power to control it. Here's where the real shock lies. Eridu, the first city, wasn't just a place for growth and innovation. It was built on forced labor. The floodplain of the Euphrates and Tigris was a dangerous, unpredictable land. The laborers didn't choose to live in these cities. They were compelled to stay, to work, to survive under the tyranny of their rulers. These were cities of coercion. What happens when people no longer work for survival, but to fuel the ever-growing ambitions of the elites? What was the real cost of this urbanization? Could it be that the first cities weren't the dawn of civilization, but the beginning of the end? The rise of cities like Uruk and Eridu may not have been about human ingenuity or the fertility of the land. What if it was about control? Control of the rivers, of the labor, and most importantly, of the people. What happens when a ruler's thirst for power becomes unstoppable, and when that power spills beyond the cities? What becomes of the world? The mystery is far from over. As the story of Mesopotamian cities unfolds, we will reveal not just the rise of Uruk and Eridu, but the hidden cost of building the first cities. Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking truths that lie buried beneath the ancient foundations of these first urban behemoths. The rise of power, the birth of writing and kingship. The first king ever known didn't build his empire with an army, he built it with words. The first cities weren't built with tools or weapons, they were constructed with the written word. What if the power of writing wasn't about recording knowledge, but about controlling the truth? What if the first scribes were not just historians, but the puppeteers behind the throne, pulling the strings of kings? The year 3500 BCE, the first cities like Uruk and Eridu had already sprung up along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. These were not just places to gather food, they were political centers. And in the heart of these cities, kings were emerging, self-proclaimed gods who used their divine authority to enforce their rule. But here's the truth. These kings didn't just rule with iron fists. They ruled with ink and clay. The invention of writing in Mesopotamia wasn't some noble effort to preserve stories or create great literature. It was a weapon. Early writing systems were designed to ensure that only certain people had access to knowledge. It wasn't about telling stories, it was about controlling the story. The very first written words were legal documents, tax records, and decrees that outlined the king's power, not just his divine mandate, but his ability to control the people beneath him. But why did this happen in Mesopotamia? Why here and not in other early civilizations? Could it be that the fertile land was not just nurturing life, but also a magnet for conflict? And did this conflict lead to the invention of writing as a tool of control rather than communication? The first kings in Sumer weren't just military leaders. They were master manipulators, using words as the ultimate tool for domination. Kings like Gilgamesh didn't just claim divine rights. They wrote it down, and so did their scribes. But what if the scribes were more powerful than the kings themselves? We often think of the king as the final authority, but in ancient Mesopotamia, the scribes had an unimaginable power. Who controlled the pen controlled the narrative. What if the scribes were the real kings, writing the laws, creating the stories, and shaping the future for centuries to come? In fact, some early rulers didn't just claim divine authority. They wrote their own mythologies, embedding their gods into stories that could never be questioned. Were these early kings just puppets of the gods, or was it the godly narrative itself that kept them in power? The first scribes were not poets. They were the first administrators, the ones who recorded taxes, debts, and laborers. The very first writings were about the practicalities of power, how much grain you owed, how much tribute you paid, how many slaves you could claim. The invention of cuneiform writing, while celebrated today as an intellectual achievement, was actually the beginning of political control. It wasn't just about communication. It was about enforcing the law and controlling every aspect of life. These kings didn't just rule from the top. They wrote themselves into history. The Sumerian king list records kings who reigned for centuries. But the truth is that many of these kings never existed in the way we think. They were constructed by scribes who gave them long reigns and divine lineages to solidify their power. But here's the twist. Were these kings really divine rulers, or were they simply using writing to sell themselves as gods? The first legal codes were not about justice. They were about control. Take the Code of Ur-Nammu, the first recorded law code from around 2100 BCE. This law code didn't seek to protect the weak. It sought to strengthen the king's control. Writing in this case didn't create a fair and just system. It created a system of obedience. The law was a means of recording the king's decisions to ensure that no one could ever challenge him. In Uruk and Lagash, kings like Lugalzagisi didn't just command armies, they controlled words. The very notion of kingship in Mesopotamia was built on a mythological narrative that began with writing. Their names and deeds were recorded to ensure they would never be forgotten and to ensure that they could never be overthrown. As we move forward, we will uncover who the real rulers of Mesopotamia were. Was it the kings, or was it the scribes who held the pen and the power? Was kingship simply a figurehead, or did the scribes play a hidden role in shaping the world's first empires? The answers might shock you. The rise of writing and kingship wasn't just about civilization, it was about domination. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into how the first kings manipulated writing, myths, and laws to secure their rule, and how the scribes may have written their own version of history, shaping the fate of an entire civilization. What if the first step towards civilization wasn't the rise of kings or cities, but the power to control words? What if the first empire wasn't built with weapons, but with the ink that flowed from the hands of the scribes, men who could make kings live forever or erase them from history altogether? 3500 BCE. In the heart of Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states are beginning to rise. Uruk, once a humble settlement, is now a bustling urban center. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provide the fertile land to support these growing cities. But what truly sets these cities apart is not just their monumental architecture or trade networks, but the emergence of a new force: written language. The first written symbols were not about preserving history, they were about preserving power. Cuneiform, the earliest form of writing, wasn't created to preserve the divine wisdom of gods or to celebrate kings. It was created to organize, to manage, to track. And the scribes, the unseen masters of ink, were the true power brokers in a land where information could shape and reshape the course of an entire civilization. The first written records in Mesopotamia weren't stories of gods or kings, but tax ledgers and inventory lists. It's a sobering thought. The first use of writing wasn't to praise the divine, but to count grain. The first scribes weren't prophets or philosophers. They were bureaucrats. But who were these scribes, and why did they hold so much power? The mystery begins to unfold. These men were not simply recording transactions. They were controlling memory, truth, and even history itself. As the kings of Sumer sent scribes to inscribe their deeds on clay tablets, the scribes knew that they were not just writing down facts. They were shaping the future. Could the scribes be more than silent servants? Could they hold the key to unlocking the true nature of kingship? And if so, who had the real power? The ruler who commanded the soldiers, or the scribe who commanded the story? It all began with a single clay tablet. The first records weren't about divine rights or conquests. They were practical. The Sumerians used writing to track the most basic aspects of daily life, from grain distribution to labor to tax obligations. But as early as 3000 BCE, writing evolved from a tool for record-keeping to a tool for governance. In a society where gods ruled, the king wasn't just a political figure. He was the divinely chosen representative of the gods. But who decided which kings were recorded as divine? Who wrote the stories that were passed down through generations? The answer was clear. Scribes. They wrote the law codes, inscribed decrees, and created legal precedents. Writing was control, and those who held the pen controlled the narrative. Here's the twist. In ancient Mesopotamia, the king might have been the ruler, but the scribe was the gatekeeper. The power of cuneiform wasn't just about recording what happened, it was about deciding what mattered. In fact, many of the earliest kings in Sumer's history were immortalized not by their deeds, but by the words of scribes. Scribes wrote the stories of their kings, making them immortal in the eyes of future generations. But, and here's the shocking part, scribes could also unmake kings. If a king didn't align with the scribe's vision or the elite's interests, his name could be erased from history. Imagine that. The fate of kings in the hands of scribes who could erase or elevate someone based on their words alone. As we move forward, the role of the scribes will reveal itself to be far more complicated and sinister than we first imagined. Who really had the power in ancient Mesopotamia? The king, the scribe, or perhaps someone else entirely? The question of who controlled the story will unfold in unexpected ways. And the true mystery, it lies not just in the writing, but in the silence of those who wrote. Imagine a world where the fate of kings isn't written in the blood of battles, but in the quiet scratching of a stylus on clay. What if the real power didn't lie in the hands of warriors or rulers, but in the hands of those who could write and erase history at will? In the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, the first cities began to emerge. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, names that would echo through history as the birthplace of human civilization. But it wasn't kings or armies that gave rise to these cities. It was the Sumerian scribes. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided fertile soil for growth, but it was the invention of cuneiform writing that truly transformed this land into the cradle of civilization. What started as a tool for keeping track of grain would evolve into the most powerful weapon in the hands of the elite. But who controlled this writing? And what did it mean for the future of humanity when words became the currency of power? At first, the scribes weren't heroes. They were mere accountants, tracking the flow of goods and people. They recorded taxes, counted livestock, and ensured the king's coffers were full. But in this seemingly mundane task, something extraordinary was happening. The scribes began to create, not just records, but legends. They were the architects of memory, responsible for recording the deeds of kings and the will of the gods. But they weren't just recording events, they were shaping them. In a world where the king's word was law, the scribes could rewrite the very fabric of reality. They didn't just capture transactions, they captured power. The stories they wrote didn't just belong to kings, they belonged to the scribes themselves. It was within this world of words that the Epic of Gilgamesh emerged, the first known literary masterpiece. But this epic poem wasn't just about the heroics of a king, it was about life and death, legacy and immortality. It was the first glimpse into the human psyche, immortalized through the pen of a scribe. But here's the real twist. Was Gilgamesh truly about a king's quest for immortality, or was it the scribe's way of cementing their own immortal legacy? Who stood at the center of these tales, the king or the scribe? Writing was no longer just a tool, it was a weapon. The scribes held the power to make kings immortal or to erase them from history. And this wasn't limited to the royalty. The common people, who could never hope to be recorded in history, became part of the story only through the scribe's eyes. What does it mean when the very foundation of truth rests in the hands of a few men who could decide what was remembered and what was forgotten? The power of the scribes didn't stop with Gilgamesh. Kings and scribes continued their dance for control, with each seeking to define reality through words. But what happened when this power was questioned? Who were the real controllers of history, the kings who wore crowns, or the scribes who wielded the pen? The answer might surprise you, and it's one that will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Mesopotamia. Kings and gods, the emergence of priest kings. The world has always believed that empires are built on strength, on sheer force and bloodshed. But there was one empire that was built on a lie, the lie that kings were gods. It's around 2334 BCE, a time when Sumer, once divided into city-states, is beginning to witness the unthinkable, unification under one rule. The world as we know it is on the precipice of a revolutionary shift, not just politically, but spiritually. The stage is set in the city of Akkad, a place where myth and reality blend in the flames of political ambition. Amidst the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have for centuries sustained civilizations, a new kind of ruler is emerging. Not merely a king, not just a general, but a man who claims the divine right to rule as an earthly god. As the sun sets on the city of Uruk, the oldest cities of the region, the tale of Sargon of Akkad begins to unfold. His story is shrouded in mystery, as powerful as it is terrifying. Who was he? Where did he come from? And how did he rise so swiftly to power? It wasn't just the conquest that made Sargon a legend. What set him apart from other kings of the time was that he wasn't just a ruler of men, he was a ruler of the divine. In a world where gods were believed to hold dominion over the heavens, Sargon boldly claimed his divine right. To the people of Sumer, he was more than a king. He was the manifestation of the gods on earth. The idea of priest-kings wasn't new. Kings and religious figures had always been intertwined in Mesopotamian culture. But Sargon's power was different. As his military conquests continued to swell, so too did his claim to divine authority. He didn't just conquer cities, he conquered minds, converting the belief that kings were divinely chosen into a tool of empire building. But how does a mere mortal convince thousands of people that he was not only chosen by the gods, but was in fact a god himself? The shocking truth is that Sargon didn't rely just on divine miracles or ancestral power. His genius lay in manipulating the system of belief itself, creating the first real empire built on not just military prowess, but the very belief in his godly mandate. Born to a humble gardener, or so the legends say, Sargon's rise was nothing short of miraculous. How did he go from being a foundling, left to die in a reed basket on the banks of the Euphrates River, to becoming the emperor of all Mesopotamia? Was Sargon truly a humble man, raised in obscurity, or was there something far more mysterious behind his origins? Some say he was the son of a high priestess, with divine blood coursing through his veins. Others claim that his humble upbringing was fabricated, part of a story designed to create a mystique that would give him the right to rule. But what is even more chilling is how Sargon's conquests seem to mirror divine will. Was he really just a man on a quest for power? Or was there something more supernatural at play? The mystery of his origins doesn't just add intrigue, it forces us to ask, what is the true nature of power? How does a single man seize control of a city, then an entire kingdom, and eventually an empire built on the backbone of belief? As Sargon's name spread across the lands, his empire grew not just by force, but by divine narrative. He wasn't just the conqueror of Sumer. He was the creator of a new reality, one where the gods and kings were fused into one. His empire was the first of its kind, a unified state under a single ruler, and it was built on the belief that kingship came from the heavens. His military genius was, of course, a part of his strategy, but the true secret of his success was his ability to manipulate the divine idea of kingship. It wasn't enough to just fight battles and win them. Sargon had to ensure that every victory, every battle he fought, was seen as a divine triumph. It was the gods themselves who were supposedly leading his armies. What's even more shocking is that Sargon's successors would carry on his legacy not just through his military conquests, but through the very belief systems he had created. The Akkadian Empire, with its roots in the divine kingship concept, became the foundation for many later empires, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. But what happens when the gods themselves are no longer enough to keep a kingdom together? Can the divine right to rule survive through the generations? Or does it eventually unravel under the weight of its own imperfection? The answers to these questions lie in Sargon's empire, but to understand them fully, we must look beyond his military conquests and divine claims. We must ask, what happens when power, religion, and empire collide? What happens when the belief in divine kingship starts to fade and the empire is left with only human rulers? The Code of Hammurabi, law and order in the ancient world. What if everything you know about justice, law, and kingship was shaped by one man's ability to make you believe he was appointed by the gods? One man whose laws didn't just govern, but bound the very soul of his people. It's 1792 BCE, and the great Akkadian Empire is falling apart. The once mighty rulers of Sumer have turned to dust, their cities left abandoned, ravaged by invasions and internal strife. Amid the chaos of collapsing empires, Babylon, a once small city-state on the banks of the Euphrates, begins its meteoric rise. But how does a city barely known on the world stage suddenly begin to dominate and reshape an entire region? Was it Hammurabi's military genius? Or was it something far darker, a manipulation of divine law to keep his grip on power? What we know about Hammurabi comes from stone pillars, clay tablets, and the legacy of his legal code. But how did he come to wield such immense power? Some say he was born to a humble gardener, a mere mortal who rose through the ranks by sheer cunning. Others argue that he was a foundling, cast aside by the gods themselves, only to rise up from nothing to claim divine right. But was he a man of destiny, or did he craft this myth to control the very perception of his rule? The question of who Hammurabi truly was isn't as simple as history makes it out to be. Was his rise the result of sheer military genius, or was it the product of propaganda? Could it be that his legitimacy was built on nothing more than his ability to convince the people that he was chosen by the gods? This is the question that has haunted scholars for centuries. The tension is palpable. Hammurabi's true origins remain a mystery to this day, and it's in this mystery that his power lies. When Hammurabi ascended to power, he did more than just consolidate his rule. He redefined what it meant to govern. He wasn't simply a king. Hammurabi became the living embodiment of divine law. But the true shock comes when we realize that his code wasn't just a legal framework. It was a tool of absolute control. Here's the twist. Hammurabi's laws didn't just serve to bring order. They were designed to keep the people in line. The laws are harsh, unforgiving in their punishments. But the real genius of Hammurabi wasn't in the law itself. It was in how he made people believe that those laws were divinely ordained. Through his divine kingship, he made them feel as though disobeying his laws meant defying the gods themselves. The real shock? Hammurabi's laws weren't just about justice. They were a masterclass in control. By dictating the penalties, Hammurabi made sure his people feared him. Fear of punishment was his weapon, and the divine mantle of authority was his shield. The Code of Hammurabi doesn't just define laws, it defines the soul of an empire. One of the laws requires that builders whose homes collapse must be put to death. But why such a harsh penalty for an accident? This law wasn't about protecting people. It was about creating a society that feared its own vulnerability. It was about making sure that everyone knew their place, from the builder to the king. And yet, despite this brutality, Hammurabi's code survived, not just as a piece of law, but as the foundation of governance for centuries. But how did it endure? And more importantly, why did it continue to influence empires for over 2 millennia? The answer isn't as simple as Hammurabi's genius. The real reason his code survived is because it created a legacy. It became a tool for all who came after to justify their own control. Hammurabi left behind a legacy, one that stretched far beyond his time. The laws of Hammurabi went on to influence future empires, from the Romans to the French Revolution. But the mystery lingers. How much of Hammurabi's empire was truly built on the divine will of the gods, and how much of it was manipulation through law? This is where the story takes a darker turn. As empires grow, they eventually fall, and Hammurabi's Babylon was no different. What happens when a civilization built on fear and obedience to divine law begins to crack? When the people start questioning the gods? As we move forward, we'll uncover the cracks in Hammurabi's perfect empire. We'll look at the dark truths hidden within the empire he created. But first, we must ask, was Hammurabi really the divine king he claimed to be? Or was his empire a grand experiment in psychological warfare, built on fear and manipulation? What if the very idea of justice, fairness, and the law was born from a king's desperation for control? What if the first lawgiver wasn't a benevolent ruler, but a master manipulator, using fear, divinity, and punishment to cement his rule over an empire on the brink of collapse? In 1792 BCE, Babylon stood at the crossroads of history, not as the glorious city it would later become, but as a desperate collection of war-torn tribes fighting for dominance in a fractured world. The Akkadian Empire had crumbled, leaving a vacuum in the heart of Mesopotamia. But what made Hammurabi's rise so unexpected? Was it his military genius, or was it something far more manipulative, a calculated play for absolute control that was hidden behind the veil of divine justice? Hammurabi didn't rise to power as a noble king, gifted with divine favor. He claimed the favor of the gods, but could it be that he manipulated the very idea of divine will to fashion a system of absolute governance? What if Hammurabi's divine right wasn't a gift, but a weapon he wielded to control the masses? It wasn't military conquest alone that secured Hammurabi's rule. It was his understanding of power. To rule was not enough. To legitimize rule was the true task. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't just a list of laws. It was a grand performance, staged for the eyes of the people. By placing the laws in public spaces, on massive stone slabs, Hammurabi told his people, "This is not my will. This is the will of the gods. Break these laws and you challenge divine authority." This was not the creation of justice. This was the creation of fear. But here's the twist. Was Hammurabi truly guided by divine will? Or was he orchestrating a system of control that masked the fact that he was the one truly pulling the strings? By making public the divine justification for his rule, was he legitimizing his authoritarian system? Not with law, but with fear. Hammurabi's code of laws was radical in its concept. A society governed not by the arbitrary will of the king, but by publicly inscribed eternal laws. The harshness of these laws is legendary, but they weren't just meant to punish. They were meant to instill obedience. The eye for an eye principle, while shocking in its severity, was more than just a law. It was a psychological tool. Obey the law or face the wrath of the gods. But how could the gods be appeased? Could Hammurabi's laws be the first propaganda for an authoritarian ruler, masquerading as divine will? Let's break this down. Hammurabi's laws were publicized to inspire terror, yes, but they also served another, subtler function. By ensuring everyone knew the punishments, Hammurabi was bringing structure to a chaotic empire. For the first time, law was no longer just about royal whim. It was about predictability. What Hammurabi gave his people was not just justice. It was a system that ensured they knew their place, in fear, in obedience. But here's where the puzzle gets more complex. Were Hammurabi's laws truly for the people, or were they a mechanism of control for the elites? Could a man who claimed divine justice be dipping into the very nature of tyranny? Hammurabi's code became a tool for the elite, but who were these elites? Hammurabi needed to control not only the common people, but also his own nobles. The harsh punishments for crimes like theft were designed to send a message to the wealthy too. Disobey and you lose everything. The punishment for theft wasn't just to recover the stolen goods, but to ensure the rich stayed in their place. Hammurabi, through law, created a world where order was ensured, but only through fear. But was this really justice, or was it a system designed to make sure the poor stayed poor and the powerful never lost their grip? As we explore Hammurabi's legacy, the code's impact on the structure of society becomes undeniable. The idea that justice was predictable, written, and unchangeable allowed civilizations to function on a massive scale. But what's truly fascinating is how the code's impact ripples through time. How much of our modern legal system echoes Hammurabi's laws? Could it be that Hammurabi's framework of punishment, systematic, harsh, and unforgiving, is closer to today's punitive justice systems than we care to admit? And yet Hammurabi's system didn't last forever. What happens when a society is built on fear, on absolute order, on control, without room for mercy or flexibility? As time went on, Hammurabi's empire crumbled, and his code eventually lost its power. But the questions still linger. Was justice truly served, or was it the ultimate mechanism of power disguised as fairness? What Hammurabi left behind was not just a system of laws, but a template for control, a legacy that's still being felt today. Could today's systems of justice, more than we realize, still operate on the principles Hammurabi set in motion? You're watching something that could change the way we see history forever, but we need your help to make it happen. We're just 1,000 subscribers away from unlocking the next chapter of Untold Stories. Your comment helps this video reach those who need to hear it. Will you help us make history impossible to ignore? Click, comment, and let's bring these forgotten secrets into the light. The Golden Age of Mesopotamia, Empires and Innovations. What if the empires we revere as the foundation of civilization were nothing more than the product of psychological manipulation, a calculated scheme to control people through law, belief, and military force? The Akkadian Empire, born from Sargon's military genius, might seem like the first great empire of Mesopotamia. But what if Sargon wasn't the son of a humble gardener? What if his rise wasn't the accidental conquest of a fragmented region, but the work of a calculating, manipulative mind who knew exactly how to bend the will of others to suit his agenda? Sargon didn't just conquer cities, he reshaped human understanding of power itself. He convinced his people to abandon their city-state allegiances and accept his empire under the guise of divine right. But where did this idea of divinity come from, and why did people so easily buy into it? What if we told you that his reign was built not on military superiority, but on the psychological tactics he used to control belief? Fast forward a few centuries, and Hammurabi emerges, not just as a ruler, but as a religious icon. By establishing the Code of Hammurabi, he didn't just lay down the law. He crafted a new reality where his laws were seen as the will of the gods themselves. The message was clear: defy the law and you defy the gods. But here's a twist. Hammurabi wasn't just a king. He was the architect of a system that broke away from divine whim and put absolute power in his hands. Every word on that stone stele was a carefully crafted message, not just to organize society, but to give him total control over every aspect of people's lives. What if these laws weren't merely about justice, but about crushing any form of dissent? Was the real purpose of these laws to structure society or to make sure no one ever questioned his rule again? As Hammurabi's laws were inscribed on that towering stele, they were more than just a legal document. They were psychological chains that bound the people's every move, every action, and every thought to the empire. But why did Hammurabi, a man whose lineage was considered humble, rise to such power? What was his secret weapon? In the next sections, we'll dive deep into how Sargon's psychological manipulation, Hammurabi's code of laws, and Mesopotamian innovations weren't just tools of empire. They were tactics of control that changed the course of human history forever. But here's the question we have to ask. What happens when the people start to believe that their rulers are gods? How does an empire that functions on fear and faith begin to fall apart? The rise of writing in Mesopotamia wasn't just about communication. It was the key to absolute dominance. The world's first written laws and the emergence of divine kingship paved the way for an irrevocable shift in human governance. But did these innovations actually create order, or were they tools designed to maintain absolute control over the masses? What happens when the very laws that hold an empire together become its undoing? The Assyrian Empire, masters of warfare and empire building. What if I told you that the first empire to dominate the world wasn't built on diplomacy, but on a simple, terrifying belief? That might, absolute and unyielding, was the only path to power? The Assyrian Empire, a cold and brutal machine of war, didn't rise through enlightened rulers or prosperous trade. They ruled through the glistening sword, enforced by terror and suffocating fear. But what truly made the Assyrian Empire so indomitable? Was it merely their tactical genius? Or was it something deeper, something more sinister, that made their empire unstoppable? When we think of the Assyrian Empire, we think of armies so powerful, so precise, they were almost mythical. The Assyrians didn't just conquer, they obliterated. This wasn't about simply expanding their territory, it was about erasing their enemy's very identity, leaving behind nothing but whispers of fear. But how did they do this? Was it just through brute force? Or did they have a secret weapon? A weapon not of iron, but of psychological warfare. Their psychological terror was designed to break entire civilizations. But behind every act of brutality, was there a deeper agenda, one that reached far beyond military conquest? Now let's talk about Sargon, the man who unified the entire Mesopotamian region under one banner, creating the first true empire. But did you know that his origins are shrouded in mystery? Was he born a humble gardener's son? Or did he rise from the riverbanks, abandoned by his parents, a foundling, to become one of the most powerful kings in history? The truth is, no one knows for sure. His rise was as enigmatic as it was brutal. And it's this very mystery, this question of whether he was born from nothing or divinely chosen, that creates a shadow over his entire empire-building legend. Why does this matter? Because in the ancient world, to rule was to be considered divine. If Sargon's humble origins were true, how did he create the first true imperial force that would change the course of history forever? Did Sargon manipulate the very idea of divinity to unite